Welcome to the Insight Politics podcast. This is episode 4. Today I'll kick off with Mary Lambie's dreadful comment on air about Trump supporters, and then recap on where National is at with the polls after another UMR poll leaked. To finish off, we have a discussion with ACT leader David Seymour on the revelations that the first weeks of lockdown may have been illegal and what ACT has to offer in this coming election. I hope you enjoy the show. The silence of News Talk ZB after their hosts and guest Mary Lambie wished ill of supporters of Donald Trump was telling this week. Mainstream media lost their collective heads over Donald Trump again. This time they accused him of suggesting people inject disinfectant. This was utter deception by the media, who paraphrased what he actually said and then conflated that with their hatred of the man who destroyed Hillary Clinton. It was fake news in the extreme, and that didn't stop our own media piling into the fake news at the same time as imploring us to trust them, oh, and by the way, begging you for money to bail them out. But first came the headlines. Time magazine said, experts warn against inhaling bleach after Trump comments. The Intercept said, Quack-in-Chief sees injected bleach tanning as COVID cures. The Washington Post, Trump comments prompt doctors and Lysol to warn against injecting disinfectants. The Guardian screamed, Donald Trump's prescription for coronavirus quite literally toxic. And NBC News said, it's irresponsible and it's dangerous. Experts rip Trump's idea of injecting disinfectant to treat COVID-19. Of course, it was all fake news, fake headlines, and even creepy Joe Biden got in on the act. And he was helped with Nancy Pelosi having a nag as well. So is it true? Did Trump tell people to drink Lysol and inject bleach into themselves to fight coronavirus? Well, in a word, no. Trump wasn't telling people to drink or inject bleach. He was asking whether or not it would be possible to clean inside the body with a similar disinfectant. He also insisted you're going to have to use medical doctors with any such practice. In other words, don't try this at home, kids. Of course, the media don't let pesky facts get in the way of a beatdown against the evil orange man, and nor did it stop a rather particularly nasty little episode on News Talk ZB last weekend where guest Mary Lambie, you know, the butter wouldn't melt in her mouth former breakfast host who was brought to tears by some speech by Jacinda Ardern sometime. She's the very epitome of a nice person, and yet decided to disgrace herself and her chortling co-hosts by wishing that supporters of Donald Trump would indeed inject bleach. Have a listen.
How does that defence work when President Trump now says this?
No, I was asking the question sarcastically to reporters like you just to see what would happen.
So he claims it was all a joke. Mary Lambie.
Yeah, and the fact that the reporter he was referring to wasn't even in the room when he said it, apparently. But I think the great news to come out of this is that all the Trump voters will inject themselves with disinfectant, which would be not a bad thing, right?
Look, I'm just trying to stop our text machine from blowing up, Mary, thanks. Because generally when you mention the name Trump... yeah, look, I mean...
He's a buffoon. He's borderline insane.
So let me jump in with that one, which is that I wouldn't want anyone to follow his advice. That would be hideous. What I would rather...
No, the hardcore Trump
I know,
voters, you do want them to...
Okay.
I want them to see the light. I want everyone to see the light. There's nothing wrong. You know, we were talking about sorry being the hardest word. There's nothing wrong saying, you know, sorry, I was backing the wrong horse. You know, even Piers Morgan said that he used to be a Trump supporter and he no longer is now. So you know, I don't want anyone to follow.
You can hear the host joining in, chortling away as she doubled down on the insult. As you can imagine, an outcry ensued on social media, and Mary Lambie, clearly practicing what she preaches to her corporate clients, promptly shut down her Twitter account and refused to answer calls, even ones to her disaster management hotline. So what did News Talk ZB do? Well, they decided to cover up deleting 15 minutes of audio from their on-demand section and then editing out the hateful part and pretending like nothing had happened. Calls and texts to NZME's managing editor Shane Curry went unanswered. Same for head of radio Jason Winstanley, and Mary Lambie likewise stayed stum. This is the very same organisation who has been telling everyone who will listen that they can be trusted, that they are ethical, and that they need a government bailout. Ironically, the very week that this came out, a large chunk of taxpayer cash landed in NZME's lap in the form of government subsidies for their broadcast licence fees. The hosts and Mary Lambie acted disgracefully. Their management covered it up and ignored calls for action when the audio was discovered and published by us. They don't deserve any public funding, and those three involved, if they'd been anyone else, would have been sacked. Paul Henry, John Tamaheri and Willie Jackson were sacked for far less. Let's see what NZME does with the inevitable complaints to the Broadcasting Standards Authority. Well, we have another week and another leaked poll. This past Friday saw another UMR poll become public. This is the polling that UMR releases to their corporate customers, and it wasn't pleasant reading for Simon Bridges and the National Party. The headline numbers were Labour 55%, National 29%, New Zealand First 6%, Greens 5% and ACT 3%. The Prime Minister also soared to her highest ratings yet of 67%, while Simon Bridges languages in numbers of a single digit. He can only hope to reach the lofty heights of Phil Goff, David Shearer, David Cunliffe and Andrew Little. The poll continues the downward trend of National, and like I discussed with Chris Trotter last episode, it has all the hallmarks of 2002. The folly of Bridges ruling out New Zealand First is laid bare, and now the National Caucus faces the very real possibility of being 20 MPs lighter come the end of September. Those MPs would most likely be the ethnic MPs and several of the Liberal wing, including Chris Bishop and Nikki Kay. Any MP with a majority of less than 6,500 is at risk. National's caucus seems timid, shivering like dogs pooping razor blades. Meekness will destroy them, and any political ambition they may have had will have evaporated. New Zealand needs a strong opposition now, especially now with our civil liberties being eroded and the government making amateur decisions. New Zealand needs a strong opposition to take the fight to them and win the Treasury benches to help right the ship. National has never got there alone, and they won't get there alone this time either. They need mates. And even an enlarged ACT party is not going to be enough. That means that National's going to have to swallow some pride and some dead rats. Otherwise, it is at least 3 more years in opposition. If they don't kneecap Bridges, then voters will have to start choosing who is to be their handbrake. Will it be New Zealand First, or will it be ACT? Both stand to gain from a sliding National. With me now is David Seymour to discuss where ACT fits into all of this and to discuss some alarming developments that have made the news today. Welcome, David.
Hey, Cam. Thanks for having me on the show.
No problem. Right, you've probably seen in the news this morning that it appears that the police legal advice, which you questioned David Parker over at one of the epidemic committee meetings, advised the government and advised the police that they actually were acting outside their authority and their actions were not in fact supported by law. Now, I'm just going to read you some key lines from an email that Deputy Commissioner Mike Clements sent on March the 28th, which is on the eve of the lockdown. He says in his email, "At the end of my email is the summary of the Crown Law advice to police with legal powers. It's along the same lines of that provided by Bill." Now, that's Bill Peoples, the National Manager of Legal Services of the police. "I have highlighted the paragraphs 2 to 4 that make it clear. For people moving about in public, either on foot or in cars, I believe we are restricted to working at level 1 in the graduated response model. I know that staff at the front line are using a range of tactics with the right intent, but are not supported by the law." He then goes on and says, Bill is working up a draft that would create an option to extend the law to the types of tactics being used now, but for the time being, that power does not exist. So those are the first two paragraphs. He's talking about making up law as they go along, and also you're talking about the graduated response model, David, which has got a 4-tier graduated response, which ends at level 4, which is arrest somebody. And level 1 is basically talking nicely to people. But he goes on further in the email to say that likewise going beyond your property for exercise, but doing so in a localized way, some have talked about staying in your bubble. It is pretty common sense stuff, while it is accepted that not everyone is following that guidance. Then he says, police powers do not extend to roadblocks, traffic stops, or the like for the purpose of testing people's compliance with the lockdown expectation. Police staff cannot direct anyone to do anything unless it is quite extreme in its nature and with direct and significant impacts for the health of others. It is unlawful to do so, and we shouldn't be doing it. David, what are your thoughts on those revelations?
Well, it makes a lot of sense. Not only was I questioning David Parker, the Attorney General, about why Crown law advice could not be released, but just last week we had Andrew Coster, the new Police Commissioner, come to the Epidemic Response Committee, and there was a real back and forth with some of the Nats and with me over why don't the police release the Crown law advice that they received on how to operate in the early phases of the lockdown. And Andrew Coster was just completely, not the word is, stonewalling, saying, oh, look, it doesn't matter, we've moved on. And, of course, the question that I wanted to ask was, well, if it doesn't matter much, why don't you just release it? Because fundamentally, we are a country based on the rule of law, and the protection that people have, no matter who you are, what sort of minority you're from, no matter how odd you may be, is that we all have the same rights written down in black and white on paper that can come to our aid if we feel we're being bullied or persecuted. And, of course, when the public see the police out there, we assume they're good people and that they are there upholding the law and upholding our own rights. We never imagined that the police of New Zealand are out there making it up as they go, and actually they're the ones persecuting us and taking away our rights. So these revelations are quite extraordinary, and to the extent that they get found to be true, I think there's a real question over whether or not the police force can continue in its highest traditions with the same people in charge.
Well, what concerns me also from reading that is it appears that the police have made recommendations to change the law on the fly, and presumably that would have been done with an order in council that would have been put before cabinet. But remember, these are extraordinary times and we're operating with a reduced cabinet. And one would assume that the Police Minister, Stuart Nash, promulgated these laws with orders in council, often known as Henry VIII clauses, and basically changed the law without any supervision from Parliament. There doesn't seem to have been any willingness to, A, tell us about this, or B, talk about fixing this with inside the Parliament at a later date.
No, and in fairness to them, under the Civil Defence and Emergency Management Acts and also under the Epidemic Preparedness Act, Parliament has given officials and Cabinet the right to act at certain times, such as when there's an epidemic notice issued or we're in a state of emergency. Now, the Section 70 of the Health Act does allow the Director General to issue a notice to all people on what the rules are for fighting an epidemic. But that didn't happen, if I remember rightly, until another week after the first week of lockdown. So if you fall back and say, okay, the Section 70 notice did give a legal basis for the police to be able to stop people and so on, and shut down businesses, you still had a whole week of it. And as an electorate MP, I had people contact me, elderly people who were abused by police for sitting on a park bench out at St Heliers, even after they explained that because of their medical condition, they needed to get out, they needed to exercise, and occasionally they needed to sit down. Like these people were in their 70s and 80s. I had a business where they were told by MB that they could stay open, and then the next day a police officer in plain clothes came in and said, you've got to shut down. If it turns out that actually those things happened illegally, then that goes from just bad conduct to a serious constitutional problem that people don't see the gravity of it, then they shouldn't be in the roles that they're currently in.
Those CDME powers that you talked about earlier, those can only be used for very serious issues, as in actually directly and immediately saving someone's life. Like, for example, removing someone from a house being threatened by a landslide, etc. They don't allow random stopping and interrogation. Neither does the Health Act. So it seems that, police cruising around telling surfers to get out of the water and doing all of these things that were highlighted and by the media, and we even had the Prime Minister standing up in her daily press conferences asking journalists for the names of these businesses that were open so action could be taken. That seems to have been actions that were outside of the law in any way that you look at it. Yeah.
As an aside, I think the police probably spent more time trying to stop people swimming than they would have spent saving anyone who did go swimming, so it was a waste of time. But more importantly, I think this has got to be a lesson in why due process, the rule of law and civil liberties matter, even at times of crisis. In fact, especially at times of crisis.
Well, what does it say, though, about police when they have Crown law advice that says to them that roadblocks are unlawful, but they allow and have even assisted some gang members in running those roadblocks? I mean, I've got a photograph of a roadblock in Northland where there's a nice little police tent erected for these people who are now impinging people's rights to freely travel. Seems the police have aided and abetted law breaking.
Well, again, I've been pretty vocal on that over the last couple of weeks, and we had another back and forth with the police commissioner, and earlier than that with the Minister of Police at Epidemic Response Committee. And basically the argument is if these roadblocks are necessary, then the police should be operating them. If they're not, then they shouldn't exist. We certainly shouldn't have people taking the law into their own hands. However, what we're now seeing is totally new development, that it wasn't even legal for the police to do it. And then you put another layer on top that the police were supporting somebody else in the community to do something that wasn't legal even for them to do. And once again, I just go back to this simple principle. We're a society where the protection that every minority has is being able to point to the law in black and white that defends its rights. And I think we've got to acknowledge that in the course of this crisis, I think we frankly lost our collective mind. And the thing that has really chilled me as a New Zealander is that people have been far more enthusiastic about calling the various bobbin lines that the government set up for us to
snitch culture, I've been calling it.
Yep, they've been far more enthusiastic about snitch culture, dobbing in their neighbours, than supporting their neighbours in debating the future of our country. Because when anyone puts their head over the parapet and says, actually, hang on, guys, I don't know if I've got this quite right, the mob is absolutely brutal, and a lot of people out there feel unwilling to express their views because they are worried about the way people will turn on them. And this is not strictly a freedom of speech issue. It's not the government stopping people saying things. But this is, I think, one of the biggest challenges that we faced before this crisis. And like a lot of things, this crisis has amplified the challenge. And the challenge is simply, how do we have disagreements in a civil way without people getting all offended and making it about their identity and saying you're a bad person because you disagree? We've got to learn to disagree civilly. Otherwise, we can't debate issues or make progress. And this COVID crisis has brought that challenge to the fore.
There's certainly a lot of lessons to be learned in all of this, and hopefully there will be a wide-ranging inquiry that will look into all aspects of how the epidemic has been handled, whether or not the reaction from government, the imposition of essentially a version of a police state for a period of time was warranted by the severity or lack of severity of the epidemic as we saw it. And I would hope that the civil rights issues would be front and centre in such an inquiry. Is that something that you will be pushing for when it comes time to start looking at all of this?
Oh, it's absolutely necessary. I haven't talked about the Royal Commissioner and inquiry yet. I think it's too early because there's stuff still happening that we might want to be included in it. Cam, this is something that reaches across the political spectrum. What I've found with the free speech issue over the last year or so is that actually there's a lot of people on the left, including people who are, old school Labour, Liberal lefties, people who are Green Party supporters, who are saying, I can't believe what world I'm living in, but the only person standing up for my basic rights is the bloody X Party.
Yep.
Well, that is the world that we're living in now. And it's important for everybody, including people from the political left, to live in a society where the rule of law protects your basic rights. So, the legality and the lawfulness of government actions has got to be part of that inquiry. The level of data and debate about the best path and the level of lockdown versus the danger of the virus has to be part of it. And most importantly, in my view, is the performance of government departments. Because we all say, aren't we proud, rally around the flag, everyone did a great job. Let's be honest for a moment. The PPE story was a disaster.
Oh, it's an ongoing disaster. I mean, I know someone who runs a rest home in Auckland. They've been screaming for PPE to be provided. The District Health Board says it's on its way, it's on its way. Well, we're almost out of level 3 and not a single piece of PPE has been delivered or supplied by the DHB, and yet every day we see Jacinda Ardern and Ashley Bloomfield saying we've got heaps of PPE, there's plenty available, and then the same goes for the flu vaccine as well. When it's clear, there's evidence out there, anecdotal and real hard evidence, that the supply lines for those are constrained by someone or some organisation, but the people who need these things just aren't getting them.
Yeah, so we have had major government failure, and yet we're saying what a great job's been done. It's PPE, it's testing. We had to stay in level 4 for an extra 5 days because the government wasn't ready to do tracing. And one of the worst things that can come out of this, well, you're probably right. And yet people are so desperate now to get out of lockdown that we almost need to go it anyway. But I think that the critical thing is that we don't end up with bigger government as a result of this crisis, because people mistakenly think the government did a good job. And that's not a political attack on the Prime Minister or the ministers. I think anyone in those seats would have been frustrated with the performance of government departments. But we don't want to give more power to government departments because the failure of the mainly health department has made this crisis so much worse than it had to be, destroyed the private sector and created a vacuum. That would be a huge mistake.
But there's also extension of powers beyond that. I can remember, when John Key was the Prime Minister, we had the left wing pretty much screeching daily about spying on citizens and the GCSB and all of that sort of thing. And yet in this crisis, we've had the development and extension of a snitch culture, gleefully, I might add, amongst some members. And now they're talking about a contact tracing app. But the civil liberties consequences of using such an app, where the government can know who you've been near, where you've been, all pretty much in real time, are the very things that those left-wing protesters were complaining about the government was going to be doing under John Key with the GCSB. And now I think they're almost forcing us all into complying and installing this app, because to not install it, then they'll say, you're risking the health of people and you're an evil person for doing that. For me, there's no way I'm going to put an app that's run by the government onto my phone at all, ever. What's your view on that, on that app?
Well, there's no way I'm putting an app run by the government on my phone, I can tell you that. Just to come back to something you said a second ago, and I will address the app because I've got a slightly different view on it. This is why I think the Greens are toast. Once upon a time, I would have looked at the Greens and said most of their environmental stuff's actually not right, and their socialism is but you got to admire them. At least they do actually have a strain standing up for civil liberties. The Kennedy Grahams and whatever, David Clendons, those guys. You actually had to have a bit of respect for them because they did have some beliefs that are important. Now those guys got turfed out, and the party is totally missing in action. I saw a leaked document from the Greens that says "Stay close to Jacinda's leadership," and I was like, "You guys realise that she's not the leader of your party, right?" So this would have been an opportunity for a Chloe Swarbrick or even a Golriz Garman, who's supposedly a human rights lawyer, to actually go rogue and stand up for some basic values, but they haven't done it, and they deserve to go under 5% and be toast, and I don't think anyone will miss them at this point.
Well, Golriz Garman, just let me interrupt you there, sorry. Golriz Garman has been all over Twitter skiting about dobbing people in at the local park that her apartment overlooks. So she's right donkey deep in the snitch culture. There's a very sort of culture of informing that she supposedly left Iran for.
Oh, no, well, I wouldn't know what she's saying on Twitter or anywhere, to be honest, but I'm glad you're following her so the rest of us don't have to. Just back on the app thing, I think we should leave room for at least this. If we're going as a species, if we're going to beat viruses, and this ultimately is a battle between species, as the virus versus the humans. Yeah. And bear in mind, there will be more, and I think we can argue about how dangerous this one was, and I think that it's been pretty clear that the danger of it exaggerated. There will be more, and as a species, we are going to have to fight viruses. And one of the big advantages we have over every other species is we've got technology, and they don't. So I do think we need to leave room for the possibility that we're going to need to use things like big data, mobile technology to beat viruses. The real challenge is how you design the technology and the laws around it to protect our privacy and prevent any one person from centralizing power through the use of those apps. And that stuff is difficult, but I think it can be done. So we shouldn't write it off. We should just approach it as using technology while protecting our privacy and preventing centralization of power.
Yeah. It's actually interesting you're talking about privacy of data and also how we've just talked about the police writing law as they go along. It's a nice segue really to flip the discussion around and start talking about the Arms Act reforms and where ACT stood in this, especially around privacy, around creating registers of firearms and owners and all of that sort of thing. We've already seen massive data breaches from the police with regards to arms registration. And now with these, apps and things that they're talking about, we've got this real issue where the government doesn't seem to be able to keep its data safe. And should we really be trusting the government to do that in creating these sorts of arms registers and gun owners registers and all of those sorts of things? But I'm more interested in the use by the police and the continued use by the police, I must say also in contravention of Stuart Nash's promise before the election that he wouldn't use orders in council to write law. That's exactly what we've actually seen from him ever since the Christchurch massacre. What's your view broadly on where we're heading with this?
Well, first of all, on a register, it's just a non-starter for two reasons. One, it doesn't do the thing it's supposed to do.
Yep.
So the idea that the government's actually going to keep it up to date and that it's going to stop people with criminal intent from committing gun crime, I mean, you'd have to be
a fallacy, isn't it?
to believe that. Yep, everywhere it's been tried, A, the government can't keep it up to date, and B, even if they could, the people who are a real problem don't have their firearms registered. And let's say it does work, okay, so someone commits a crime with a stolen firearm, and well, the net benefit is you know who had it before it was used to commit a crime.
Yeah.
So it's just completely useless at achieving what it's supposed to achieve. But here's the next thing, as you've alluded to, a government register of firearms is one leak away from being the most valuable steel-to-order list in the country, and one that will put huge danger into the families of a whole lot of law-abiding people who've done nothing wrong other than safely store their firearms and then have them leaked. People that own firearms go to huge efforts not to talk about what they have outside of a very tight and trusted circle. So the idea that the government would create a list of the locations of every firearm in the country, I mean, it sounds more like the start of a bad joke than an actual policy to make people safer. So the register's a non-starter. I think when it comes to the police use of order and council to make law, look, all eyes on the court today, because Colfo are in court in Wellington,
yes,
and they are challenging the effective confiscation of a whole lot of property by order and council, and I'm talking about the bans on ammunition. And I'm very scared about it because obviously I hope the courts are going to tell the executive government exactly where to go, but there's also a chance that the courts will say that's all fine, and at that point I'm not sure what we do.
Well, it is a concern, confiscation of property in New Zealand has traditionally also included compensation. That's why when they brought the gun ban in on semi-automatic firearms, that there was what they called a buyback, but they never had them in the first place to be able to buy them back. But that's just semantics. But there was compensation for having your assets confiscated. When land is taken under the Public Works Act, there's compensation. When things are, even in the Arms Act as it existed prior to the massacre, if there were firearms taken from you, the law actually said that it had to be paid for them at a fair market value. But in this case with the ammunition, you're right, it's been made illegal. People have had to hand it back for rather spurious reasons. And it seems to have been a grab bag by the police to take away legitimate ammunition without any sort of technical understanding of the process that defines that ammunition. And this is the problem that I've seen with a lot of the Arms Act proposals and things that I've been fighting against, is these arbitrary decisions made from a position of a lack of intelligence over definitions. We had lever action rifles, for example, banned because they had a tubular magazine. It's just nonsensical stuff. And it concerns me that the police continue to do this.
Yeah, and I remember sitting down at the very beginning of all this, when we, straight after the tragedy in Christchurch, and we're at the Finance and Expenditure Committee, and I just said, folks, what are we actually trying to ban here? Is it a certain rate of fire? Is it a certain amount of energy at the muzzle? Is it a certain caliber of, what are we trying to ban here? And I never got an answer to that question. So then you start picking up arbitrary distinctions, and you end up banning things that actually needn't have been banned, like these kind of toy cowboy guns, these sort of lever action rifles that don't really do much. Tubular magazine, the most hopeless thing that a person could have if they had evil intent. And yet, the government spent how many million handing them in. The other thing if I could just make another observation, is that the reason all this happens is that most of the people in power have contempt for the licensed firearm community. They don't understand them, they have no empathy, and they assume they're bad people, because most of their encounters with firearms are in violent movies or crime on the news. And what I've found real interesting, because I've never claimed to be a gun part of the LFO community, I don't do fake.
Yeah.
But I've got to know a lot of people, and I can say hand on heart, I think they're very good people, having visited many NZDA ranges and pistol clubs and antique arms and all the rest. But what's interesting is that the people on the other side of politics who say be kind and we're about well-being and compassion and all that stuff that go on ad nauseum, they can't show any empathy or any understanding of a group of people that just have a different hobby. Now, this is what I find so interesting, is that they have repeatedly said that there's a group of people that have no rights, and what it shows is that the current lot in power don't believe in rights, they don't believe in minority rights, they only care about causes that are fashionable for them.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a shooter myself, and in some regards, I think some of the reforms were needed and necessary. In fact, I've spoken at length with rather senior people in the firearms community saying having a attitude of not 1 inch, we're not going to budge 1 inch in any reforms, doesn't solve anything. And in a large, I believe that a large component of the grab of firearms was because of the intransigence of some of the senior members of the arms community in opposing really rather minor changes. And I said, in fact, to Colfo and to many other people, you know what, if you keep up with this attitude, you're only one massacre away from having your guns taken away, which proved prophetic in the end. But if they had acted in earlier attempts to modify the law to make things a little bit more clearer or stricter, there may not have had to have been a buyback. And so,
yeah,
the example of that is I had proposed, or I'd suggested to very senior people, that the problem with the A category semi-autos, and I have a couple of semi-auto shotguns that are within the current rules, but I've never had a semi-automatic AR-15 or an AK-47 or anything like that. I just have never had a sporting need for that. Now, there's a very limited number of people who have a sporting need for that, but those people are also usually B category holders, pistols, or C category collectors, and they have an E category license as well, which is increased security and all of those sorts of things. And so my solution was to say, let's say that there'll be no A category semi-autos unless they've got a limited capacity like a duck shotgun or something like that. and move as many of them as possible to the E category, which has got increased security, increased safes, increased checks, and then add in a component like having a pistol license, which requires 12 visits to a club in a calendar year. And I think that would have gone a long way to solving the issue, but of course that was rejected outright by many people. And so when the court... Yeah. Go ahead.
Look, we're speaking the same language. I think basically the problem is, how can an Australian weirdo who lives alone as a single guy get off the plane by a couple of AR-15s, 3,000 rounds of ammo and one batch signed off by the police?
Signed off by the police,
and,
totally.
His travel history included going to places like Saudi Arabia and North Korea, and there was no system in place to say, geez, that's a bit odd. Maybe someone should go and pay him a visit. There was clearly a failing, and part of it, as you rightly allude, is the erosion of what the A category meant. So all of a sudden you could have an AR-15 on A category. That wasn't the original intention. And part of it was the erosion of the face-to-face training, which meant that all of a sudden you could get to the stage you got to, apparently, without actually talking to anyone. So, the laws needed to change, and the only way forward is a constructive approach. So, there's somebody that said, we're going to get into power and turn everything back to the way it was on March 14.
It's not going to go back. It's just not.
And it's politically idiotic. So, X's approach is we actually do want to get in and get some leverage over the next government and say, look, we're going to do what the government should have done post-March 15. We're going to get everyone around the table, maybe even the so-called public health idiots, the Hera Cooks and the rest of them, and we're going to say, okay, how do we actually have the world's safest gun laws? And that
we already did. We already did have the world's safest gun laws, though, David. That's the thing. So it's how do we make them even more safer?
Yep. Okay. So semantics. Yep. And then we say, okay, we're going to put the emphasis back on proper testing, training of the people. Way less emphasis on this whack-a-mole where we try and define the type of firearm, and we're going to have a real sense of trust and dignity for people that have got through the test. Because at the moment, basically, you've got no trust, no dignity, and then try and define the firearm. And, of course, you end up with a whole lot of people that don't feel trusted and they can get any firearm they want through a loophole, and then crazy things happen. So we've got to go back, get people around the table, start again, and actually, once again, truly have the best firearm laws in the world.
That trust issue that you raise, I think, is very important, because the 250,000 firearms owners out there who, by rights, probably support the average police officer on the street. They might not agree with the hierarchy of the police, but by and large, they generally used to think the police were okay. Those people have lost trust with the police. And then when you look at the actions of how the police have acted during this, the arms recovery, the hounding and victimising of people simply for owning firearms, the behaviour of people like Mike Clements, for example. And then if you just remember back to where we originally started this conversation about the police wanting to make laws on the fly to do things and have been acting unlawfully, at least in the first part of the lockdown, then you've got a general lack of trust in the police. And it really comes around to a full circle is, should the police actually be administering the Arms Act anymore? Should that actually be, in terms of licensing and vetting and checks and all of that, should that now be an external independent organisation, and then the police are used for enforcement when that organisation, much like the Electoral Act is administered by the Electoral Commission and the police do the enforcing of any breaches of the Electoral Act. Do you think it's time that we actually had an independent body that's separated out from the enforcing of the Arms Act?
Well, that's certainly exposition, and I think the nets are open to this too, that we're going to have first of all, there's basically three jobs. So there's the policy, there's the enforcement, and there's the administration. And at the moment, the police are giving the policy advice, the police are doing the administration, the police are doing the enforcement, and it's a disaster. So I would take the policy advice out, maybe Ministry of Justice, so the government's actually getting a bit more sober view of what firearm laws should be. Then I'd leave the enforcement with police, because that's fundamentally what they're good at. But they can't do the administration for two reasons. Number one, most of the people police deal with most of the time are criminals. So when they deal with you, they
treat you like a criminal.
They realise you're not a criminal. Well, yeah, I mean, it's just nature, right?
Yeah.
So, and second of all, they're not the right organisation. No one joins the New Zealand Police because they want to maintain a database. And, it's a little bit like what you see with cars. Yes, the police are in charge of enforcing the basic rule.
But registration's the land transport.
But you don't sort of get stopped by the cop, and he goes and has a look and says, "Oh, geez, I don't know, I think your brake pads are a bit thin, mate." Or, I mean, that's just ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
But that's basically what we expect with firearms, is that the police are the administrators of the firearm law as well as the enforcers. So absolutely, you got to have a third-party organisation that is responsible for monitoring who is a fit and proper person and does the training, keeps the data up to date, does it right. And again, you may disagree on this, but I think part of the deal has to be that they have some more access to data. So, for instance, they've got to be able to monitor patterns. If somebody suddenly buys 3,000 rounds of ammo for an AR-15, I think that should be a warning bell. If someone's also a foreign national and you've got their travel history and you know where else they've been in the world, such as North Korea and Saudi Arabia, that should be a warning bell. So I think that part of the quid pro quo is that organisation's going to have to be really good at data, but the deal is, in return for that, people that have been approved fit and proper actually get some trust and dignity back.
Well, that's the whole thing about fit and proper. So, yeah, I agree with you on that. There has to be some way to do this, but I don't think, standing there wagging the finger and lecturing firearms owners who, by and large, are law-abiding people. Sure, there's some people out there you think, gee, I'm surprised you've got a firearms license, but they'll eventually get weeded out. Sensible people, will take action in the end. But it's an interesting proposition. But the doctrinaire approach.
Well, you say sensible people will take action, but I got a pistol club. I won't say which one, and I just said to the president, okay, so what happens if someone comes along and you form a view that maybe this person's not quite the right person to have a pistol? I said, what do you actually do? He said, we just tell the cops to get them taken out. I said, really? He said, yeah, we got one deported. I said, okay, so you potentially got a terrorist of the type who have suffered in Christchurch kicked out of the country because they tried to come along and shoot it. You sized it up and got rid of it. I said, yeah, absolutely. Now, my question is, has the actions of the government and police, or at least the police hierarchy, over the past 18 months made it more or less likely that will happen again?
I don't think it's done either. It's neither more or less likely that there's going to be another massacre. There will be another massacre. It just will happen, whether they use a firearm or some other form of weapon. It's kind of immaterial. If someone wants to commit mass murder, they'll do it. They'll use a truck. They'll use a car.
Yeah, well, I hope you're wrong. But
so do I. But I'm a realist.
But I'm just asking, more or less likely that members of the community, after the way they've been treated, will act as the proactive eyes and ears of law enforcement.
I think it's less likely. Yeah, I think it's less likely.
Now less likely.
Yeah,
and we are less as a result of the government's options.
Yeah, I mean, I'll use my own example. I'm less likely to engage with the police now, because if you engage with the police and you're a firearms owner, you're treated like a criminal, and so when you're treated like a criminal, you just stop engaging. And so, yeah, I think you're right. It's less likely to assist the police with inquiries. You know, I mean, I had some police turn up at my house and said they wanted to look at my safe, and previously I would have said, sure, come in and have a look, but I don't now. When they came, I said, you didn't make an appointment. I said, oh, we don't need to. I said, well, yes, you do. You need to look at the law. You do need to make an appointment, and I'm not available right now for you. Oh, we're here now. Can we just have a look? I said, no. Leave. Now, previously I would have complied. I would have assisted the police. It would have been, but I don't trust them anymore. You don't know what they're actually really there for. And when they rock up with a Glock on their hip and a taser in hand, it's rather sinister.
Yeah, and isn't that, let's just reflect on that for a minute. Isn't that a shame?
Yes.
This is the country where I think it's a point of pride, but we have a police force that is not routinely armed. And the reason for that is that we're a high trust society with good values for the most part. That's what we're losing.
But the police went, after disarming a large number of people of supposedly dangerous firearms, they then launched the arms response teams where they were routinely armed and trolling around, South Auckland and in these SUVs, rather sinister-looking, dark-coloured SUVs, telling us that they needed to have armed response. It just doesn't gel, and that trial's supposed to come to an end. And I can just imagine what the result of the trial is going to be, because the police ran it. It'll be a stunning success, and can we have more of them, please? You just can see it coming, can't you?
Well, unfortunately, it's a worldwide trend that as soon as you create a government department, their incentive is to empire build, and it's the same reason that we started off with 900 Ministry of Education staff under 5 schools, and now we've 2,600, and I paid more than the teachers. Sadly, this is why I always take the position of being anti-government and sceptical about government, is because it's a bit like rust. It always comes back, or as Richard Prebble says, government's like acorns, they grow.
Well, that's a perfect segue into why act at the next election. You've always seen the party as being that anti-big government. The polls are all over the place at the moment. There's votes up for grabs, and it looks like your principled position is being rewarded at the moment. Where do you see ACT as positioning itself for the next election, which is only a few months away? And what's your prediction or guess or whatever you want to call it for where you'll end up on September the 19th?
Well, first of all, the thing about ACT is that we're authentic. We've always said that big government is a menace, that we are poorer than we would otherwise be if we had the courage to have lower taxes and give people stronger property rights, more choice in education, and all of the stuff that we've talked about with charter schools or whatever. So, we're 100% authentic. I think a couple of things have changed lately. One is that because of the government we've got in, people's liberties have been under a much more real threat, and that's seen more people turning to ACT. And I think the other thing that's changed is that, frankly, I've just got a bit better at it. So, you've had a go over the years.
Of course.
But how many people do you know that have got into Parliament themselves and become the leader of a political party at 31 years old? But 5-6 years on, I think I'm getting a bit better at it. And we've got a lot more great people coming to join us. So definitely good momentum. And I think that there'll be people who say, okay, we actually want to put the right back in centre right. We want a government that's going to stand up for some principles, particularly individual freedom. And what's the choice? Well, if you vote for the Nats, good on you, but you're basically helping get an extra Maureen Pugh. No offence, I like Maureen personally, but you're going to get another person into the National Caucus who may not share your values. On the other hand, if you give your party vote to ACT and bring more ACT MPs in, then you're going to bring more of that authenticity and principle, drag the whole thing to the right. I think that's what people are responding to. And as you say, the polls are all over the place. I mean, the last 3 alleged polls that I've heard about, mostly from people that are pretty credible, it's at 3, 4, or 5%. So let's be modest and say we're at the bottom of that at 3%. That means we're sitting on 4 MPs with 4 months to go, and I think you can see ACT come out with 5 or 6 MPs, and if New Zealand First and the Greens go under and the Nats sort themselves out, then you could end up waking up on September 20 with a government that is national but has enough ACT in it that you'll actually see movement on firearm law reform, replacing the RMA with something sensible, and just a general switch towards fiscal responsibility, because right now I think the danger is that we're going to mortgage not just our children's future but our grandchildren's future, and we're going to do it with phony money printed by the Reserve Bank. That's the kind of stuff we've got to stop.
Yeah. So let's spitball something here for a bit, because I don't agree with you 100% on where you see things heading. I actually see that we're in a 2002 type scenario where the 2 major parties will slip, one more than the other. It doesn't really matter which, but they will slip. No MMP government anywhere in the world has ever delivered a single party majority, and I think the chances of that are unlikely, though not impossible.
The Germans did once, but I take your point.
Yeah. So we have to operate in an MMP environment, and I think ACT works very well in the MMP environment. Certainly ACT voters understand the MMP environment. My concern is that national voters still think along the lines of a first past the post mentality, that a lot of them consider the fact that the government wasn't formed with national because they came first, that they consider the current government to be called the coalition of losers, which actually highlights their mentality on where things are. But at the moment, I see national as slipping away somewhat, and every percentage point they slip away from 40% makes it harder mathematically for a national and ACT government. So in order to get a government, there's going to have to be an accommodation, and the likely party for that, you're not going to see eye to eye with the Greens, and it's unlikely that you'd see eye to eye with Labour to actually have an influence on a government from ACT with them. That only leaves New Zealand First and National and ACT. Would you serve in a government that had New Zealand First in it as well as yourselves?
Well, I wouldn't serve in a government. I think ACT's role is to stay outside government, and people that have gone into government, it hasn't ended well for them as minor party.
So support. I'm talking about support then. Let's say that National and New Zealand First had enough with the help of ACT to form a government. Would you go along with that?
Well, put it this way, we wouldn't cross the floor and create a government with Labour to undermine them, but there'd be some real restraints on them. So all this stuff that you're hearing from New Zealand First this week about reintroducing a fortress economy, they'd never get support to do that. Any ideas of introducing new taxes have no support from us to do that.
Yep.
Anything to do with messing around with monetary policy and printing new money, they'd never get support from us to do that.
Yep.
So I think in that scenario, we would act as a handbrake on some of their crazier ideas, and just handing out money, the latest version of flavour of corporate welfare, whatever they want to call it, a provincial growth fund.
Yeah.
They wouldn't get support for that. So basically, we'd be there as the anchor, keeping them right and keeping them away from their crazier ideas. And of course, we'd also expect them to do one thing, which is to actually deliver on the firearm law reform, because both those parties are theoretically committed to it. So let's go.
Yeah, the reality is they're the only party at the moment that can stop some of the excesses of the Arms Act. But I'm glad you mentioned the fact that the Act could act as a handbrake. Now, just to extend that analogy a little bit, in order for the handbrake to be effective, it needs to be installed in a car. So from your perspective, what does that car look like?
Oh, well, I always go with my Lotus 7 if I need a car analogy. But look, I think what you're trying to get at is what's that overall government that we're trying to restrain from going nuts. And I think
because let's face it, Nationals like Labor but less shit.
Well, yeah. I mean, so in theory, you're assuming a lot here.
Yes.
Like National and New Zealand First are going to work together. I mean, they've already ruled that out.
Well, Nationals ruled it out.
Their mind. Who knows? Yeah. So let's say that happens. There's a few things that the next government is going to wake up on September 20th have to do. One is that they're going to have to get back to surplus as quickly as possible. It's possible we've done numbers by 2024. Otherwise, you're mortgaging your kids' future.
Yeah.
Two is that they're going to have to restore sound money, because what Adrian Orr's doing is almost at Zimbabwean proportions. He's proposing to help monetize the government's investing in the recovery, and this is just completely nuts.
Well, governments don't invest in anything. I always love it when they say they're investing in welfare. That's not investing, that's throwing money out the window.
Yeah, so if people want to have any chance of building their homes and their businesses and their futures, then you got to get sound money, balanced budgets, and no new taxes.
Yeah.
Then you got to get stuck into the stuff that's holding people back. So I see yesterday the government said they're going to do RMA reform, but only for select projects they like. Well, I mean, this is almost worse than doing nothing. So they now understand the RMA is the problem for people up and down this country, but it's taken a crisis for them to realise it, and they're only going to provide exemptions for the things that they like. We've got to deal with that. It's 26 years old.
It's almost Muldoonist, isn't it? It's almost Muldoonist, the outlook.
It is, and this is what I mean about the crisis was made much worse by government. We cannot reward government by giving it a bigger role in the recovery simply because due to its failure, the private sector's been hollowed out. That would be a massive injustice. And then you look at some of the other stuff going on in government. I mean, employment law, health and safety. There's a whole lot of stuff going on that makes you wonder why anyone still bothers to run a business or employ anyone. So we've got to actually get a private sector recovery by getting government out of the way, rather than a public sector recovery rewarding government for its failure.
That for me, I mean, I'm a social liberal and a fiscal conservative. I should be a natural ACT voter, and yet every time it comes to election, I don't vote ACT. What are you going to do to address? I mean, those all seem very sensible things, and I agree with those, but I also agree with some of the things that New Zealand First is saying about bringing some of our supply chains home, not outsourcing things to China. We still have, we have to be a trading nation. So some of the more excessive things in New Zealand First I don't agree with, but you can never agree with anything altogether. But what is going to be the thing that gets people like me to actually tick that box for ACT in the party vote? People who are social liberals, but fiscal conservatives.
Well, if you're a social liberal, then you've got quite a lot there. I mean, we're the only people on the right that have consistently advanced free speech, assisted dying, voted on abortion law reform as liberals. So they're pretty strong credentials there.
Yep.
When it comes to the New Zealand First stuff, I'm not avoiding a question, but let's just be clear about what they're proposing. They are proposing Fortress New Zealand, And the reality of it is a giant bureaucracy deciding what you can buy from overseas and what you must buy in New Zealand. That's what it means when you say bring our supply chain home. And we've been down that track in this country, and it wasn't pretty. And there's really no way I can see them bringing it back. But if they did, it would be hugely costly. That brings you back to what's going to make people tick the box for ACT. Well, because we're the only ones that have consistently stood up for free markets and free minds. And if you feel like government's got completely out of control in these 3 years and it threatens to get more out of control with the likes of even New Zealand First, then who can you vote for that you know on a consistent and authentic track record will stand up and say, we stand for the rights and especially the property rights of the individual to go about their life and make their own choices without being jerked around by government on a daily basis.
Sounds like you've hijacked the founding principles of the National Party there, David.
Well, yeah, everyone likes the founding principles of the National Party, but I don't know, like what went wrong there. It seems that the one group of people that haven't read them is the current National Caucus, and that's their problem.
and we won't have any disagreement from me on that one. I mean, that's the thing. You made the comment that I've been a little bit harsh on you in the past, but I consider criticism to be there for people to take on board to make themselves improve. And I've got to say, David, that I've been watching your performance in the Epidemic Response Committee meetings, and I've watched every single one of them. So I'm as tragic as you having to participate in them.
Yeah, you should get a medal or something for that.
But I think it's important though that people do watch them, because you can see how people perform in the environment that's normally hidden inside Parliament for the first time. And credit where credit's due, I think that your contributions to those have been perceptive. They have been constructive, and you've also taken an important role of holding the government to account in areas where they've been lacking. And a classic case was your raising of the issue that we spoke about at the beginning of this podcast with David Parker. But you have confronted others. So credit to you. You've actually done well and gone up immensely in my rather harsh opinion that I have of most politicians. And you're actually performing, in my view, the role of the leader of the opposition. But sadly, you're not in that position at the moment.
Oh, it's very kind of you to take Cam. I appreciate it. And look, what I'd say to people is, my goal is to recreate an ACT party as a going concern that's bigger than me. And there's an opportunity to help us do that. And I think people are going to like some of the candidates we're rolling out, towards the election.
Yeah, I can't wait to see who you're going to have there, because it's going to be actually critically important, because you could end up with 5 or 6 MPs if things go well.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that'll give our listeners a good impression of where you stand on these things. And thank you for your comments on the revelations that have come out about the unlawfulness of at least the first couple of weeks of the lockdown. And hopefully you go on to greater and better things, David. Thank you for your time.
No problem, Cam. Thank you very much. And isn't it phenomenal? You've got the whole press gallery begging for government money to keep journalism going, and the biggest scoop of the year so far got sent to you. Unbelievable.
Well, they mock and deride, but I just keep soldiering on, and that's the way I'm going to always operate. News Talk ZB's management have some unanswered questions that need addressing. People have been sacked for much worse, but News Talk ZB seems to think that total silence will get them through. No doubt they'll whitewash away any issues by saying they deleted the offending audio and ignore the fact that Mary Lambie so outrageously wished harm on people simply for their political beliefs. If she says things like that in public, one can only imagine what she says in private. Once again, the media and News Talk ZB in particular have shown there's one rule for the ordinary folks and other rules and standards for media lovies. National faces a tough next few months. They need to resolve the issue of their failing leadership, otherwise voters will turn elsewhere. There is one person and party standing up for our rights, and they have a proven track record in fighting for freedom of speech, standing up for gun owners, and the general rule of law and property rights. David Seymour made a good case for ACT to be a viable candidate for your party vote this election. Thank you to all the BFD subscribers. Your contributions help keep the BFD operating as a truly independent media outlet, presenting as many views across the political spectrum as possible and holding the powerful to account. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the chat with David Seymour.